Hey, so welcome back. I'm gonna talk a little bit about Henry David Thoreau, and he's a very interesting cat. And I noticed that a lot of his ideas are still very apparent today. He was educated at Harvard, and he has a nice relationship with nature, kind of like Emerson. Now, he has a very particular area that I wanted to discuss with you. It's a title called Resistance to Civil Government. So, here he goes. He says, I heartily accept the motto that government is best which governs least, and I should like to see it acted up to more rapidly and systematically. Carried out, it finally amounts to this, which also I believe, that government is best which governs not at all. So, essentially, that means he's in favor of small government. And today in America, the political parties that would most agree with him, you could say, is a Libertarian Party. And I guess traditional conservatives would say that, yeah, we want small government and we want small intervention. So when he says not governs at all, it sounds like it's bordering on anarchy. And yes, indeed, he did say in later parts that he's kind of for no government at all, but he realizes practically that we do need government, right? Now, what is fascinating is that today, we kind of have big governments, and there's pros and cons of small government. So let's say for small government, yes, they won't intervene a lot, but then that goes back to the premise of what do you think the government's job is? Is it to regulate industry, to solely conduct trade and military measures? Or does the government have a social responsibility? Now, Thoreau clearly lays out in his later parts that he feels he doesn't have a duty to society. Now, he does say, though, that the individual is a separate entity from the government. The government doesn't have a right to rule an individual's life and tax them to death, and that we do have the right to revolution if needs be. So he mentions a little bit here. He goes, the standing army is only an arm of the standing government. So basically he sees the military as the arm of the government. And that is true. If you think about it, they really are the lapdogs of the government. Now, the noble side, there's two sides to a soldier. The noble side that protects and defends the weak. And then there's the sadly developing part of today where they are the attack dogs of whatever the military-industrial complex desires. And it's not necessarily just about safety anymore, because safety can also be defensive and offensive wars, but apparently today we do a lot of offensive coups. Our CIA does, at least. And then the soldiers have to go in and try to break bread between those who caused the problem in the first place. He also contends that, about government, he's continuing later on, that the government does not keep the country free. It does not settle the West. It does not educate. The character inherent in the American people has done all that has been accomplished, and it would have done somewhat more if the government had not sometimes gotten its way. For government is an expedient by which men would fain succeed in letting one another alone, and, as has been said, when it is more expedient, the governed are most let alone by it. Trade and commerce, if they were not made of India rubber, would never manage to bounce over the obstacles which legislators are continually putting in their way. Okay, so I'll stop there. So what he's basically saying is that government comes off as it gets in the way. And what that means today, in today's terms, because he's writing in the 1800s family, is that regulation. Now, a lot of libertarians and conservatives, those on the right, and some centrist people who lean right, would argue that excessive government regulation taps up the ability of the market to freely flow, and that the balance is off skew, and therefore true capitalism and entrepreneurship cannot happen when the government puts too much red tape. The flip side of that, though, family, what someone on the left would say, a progressive indeed, a socialist democrat, a democratic socialist, sorry, family, a liberal would say that you need government regulation because without it, corporations will run rampant and everything will be externalized in costs and nothing will be internalized, and that unfettered capitalism leads to crony capitalism and a corporatocracy, and that indeed not to its they would contend that over idealizing the free market just allows corruption and corporate greed to flow freely. Okay, so a good example of what the left might say is that look at the food industry, you need regulations on food industry. The other argument they would say is that you need a union. Now, the right would say, well, you don't need unions. Unions can't negotiate contracts really well, and therefore it's not right for a union to demand of a labor, the owner of the means of production, right? If you want to use a bourgeoisie Marxist tone, that they don't have the right to dictate terms to the corporation, and instead they need to negotiate salaries. They need to negotiate benefits and stuff like that. But you'd have to be really careful. I think it depends on what industry. So when Thoreau is saying that, government always gets in the way, indeed it is true that in some cases they do, but in other cases they need to be there, especially for pollution issues. And even then, companies like ExxonMobil will pay lobbyists to bribe politicians and nudge them in the wrong way, and then they end up polluting anyways. So he continues a little bit further down, and he says, let every man make known what kind of government would command his respect, and that will be one step forward in obtaining it. So he's very free speech. So he wants people to say, hey, I want this type of government. And then he contends that once we start to actually verbalize, to cognitively think what kind of government we want, we will then be closer to achieving said goal. And this is very interesting if you look at it from a psychological perspective, because a lot of psychologists say that once you write something down, it's almost like you are bringing it to life. You are a tad bit more dedicated to it. And instead of being silent and rolling around the ideas in your head, to say something is to be active. And to be active is to create a different energy in the field around you. And therefore, that can lead to certain events or triggering of events that will help said idea manifest. So I like that. He's very pro free speech. And even if you don't agree with what your neighbor is saying and type of government they want, they should still say it, because maybe you two could have like, hey, you want this type, I want this type. Okay, I'll take that policy, you can take this policy. Okay, I don't like your domestic policy, but I like your foreign policy one. I don't like that regulation, we could change it this way. Oh, this tax could be reduced, or this tax could be raised, right? We can come together and we can learn. So I see him as somebody who sees that in a very powerful way. And here's another example of when he decides to go on further. The mass of men serve the state, thus not as men mainly, but as machines with their bodies. Okay. Now, this is interesting because remember when he said that the military is the arm of the government, right? And okay, so let's take the soldier in this analogy that he lists for us. They are a machine. So in his mind, some soldiers, indeed not all, but those who have been, propagandized and are no longer a self-actualized thinking individual, they might be a killing machine, right? A machine that simply boop, 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 put in the orders, go do it, that's it. On the flip side, we could say, let's take a good example of minimum wage workers, right? You got a minimum wage worker. To them, they're a body, sort of almost like a little and let's just say like an automaton, right? That's a good word. An automatonic type of machine, alienated robotic human who's working minimum wage and feels like a cog in the wheel, and they are simply rolling out the motions and doing what they can to gain capital for their employer while they live off of very small wages. Now, those people are a machine to the state. They are working to barely survive, they pay taxes, and they are producing data points for the GDP, right? They are a statistic, they are an economic asset to the nation. Okay, family? So I agree with that. And he continues that such command no more respect than men of straw or a lump of dirt. They have the same sort of worth only as horses and dogs. Yet such as these even are commonly esteemed good citizens. Others, as most legislators, politicians, lawyers, ministers, and office holders, serve the state chiefly with their heads. And as they rarely make any moral distinctions, they are likely to serve the devil, without intending it, as God. Okay, so what I get from that is that he's saying that those who serve the state through the mind, not through the body, like the soldiers or like the peasants, right? They use their mind. They're actually, like, let's say a lawyer, he gets off some guy who screwed over a bunch of people, and he simply is able to get him off because he's really good at rhetoric. Okay, he's really slimy. He's gross. He knows the political jargon game of the court. The entire justice system is a court. It's like a game. Okay? And it's which lawyer can bounce ideas off and not have inconsistencies and use that to convince the judge of who's right and who's wrong. Okay, family? That's a very pessimistic, nihilistic view of the court system, but I think evidence in America would show that my hypothesis about that is true. So, continuing further, so remember when he just said that they actually serve the devil instead of God? So he gives an example of a politician. So let's say we have a politician. Let's take a controversial example to be fun. Let's say you have there was a politician from Georgia, and you can look this up, I believe it was Georgia. He argued that post-birth abortion is a right for mothers, okay? And it was unclear where he was saying if the baby had solely survived an abortion, and then it was between the doctor and the mother to decide should you kill this baby even though it survived, which is in essence infanticide. But the thing is, let's say this politician, and let's say at the federal level even, this gets passed where, hey, your kid, if it's born and you don't want it, and you try to get an abortion but it survived, it has no legal rights, and you can therefore commit infanticide, and therefore when it is killed, the parts of the baby can be sold for medical research, which is happening, which does happen. Baby parts are sold, okay? And that's a fact. So, who is that serving? Okay? Is that really something holy that God would endorse? If we're looking from a theological aspect, if we take a Islamic, Jewish, Christian aspect of that, they would say no, you should not kill a living baby that survived an abortion, okay? Because it's beyond the point of when did life begin, and it now can exist outside the womb and has passed the usual laws. Usually the marker for abortion is at 25 weeks. Okay, family? So the legal argument, most common sense people would say, it's out of the body, it can survive out of the body, therefore it has citizenhood. It now is a separate entity from the mother, and now it has the right to a social security number, it has a right to life. Okay, so let's say this politician overrides that, and his cohorts, his cabinet, whoever is around him, his campaign managers, Locasia, they decide, no, we're going to get this through the House, we're going to all vote on it, and we're going to pass this. And then we find out that, let's say, more and more women, they give birth, let's say, and then they say, hey, you know what, I kind of changed my mind. I don't want the baby anymore. How much can I get? Let's say there's an offer for how much can I get if I get rid of the parts, and will I go to jail? They'll be like, no. Now, that would be an example of Thoreau saying that they are serving the devil instead of the God, which is essentially, in a more secular term, good and evil. Okay, so even if you don't want to look at it from Thoreau's perspective of a good entity and a negative entity, you could look at it as in morally and ethically correct. Okay, so if it's for legislators, so that example I gave of infanticide, post-term abortion, this is a common topic going on in the United States right now, and people who are would argue, they would say, well, they're only saying it in case they have deformities, but other people would say, no, we're not just talking about that. So it's an active, complicated, dynamic, convoluted, fake news infested topic. But I have seen actual politicians talk about this. Okay, so what I just said right there is not like some conspiracy theory tinfoil hat. And if you pay attention to politics in the United States, you would see that that's a real thing that people want to do. Okay, and then lawyers. So he says that many of them serve the state with their head. And remember, he sees the state as a negative force. He sees the state as something that is inherently parasitical, tyrannical, and incapable of consistent morality if the populace does not actively rebel and control their government. So the government serves the people for Thoreau. The people do not serve the government. So he's warning right here about how these particular legislators, politicians, lawyers, and ministers and office holders serve the state chiefly with their head, and more often than not, they serve the state in a negative way that impacts people negatively. So, yes, that is very true. And office holders and lawyers, who hasn't heard of the story of a grimy, slimy lawyer? I mean, the guy who got Casey Anthony off, I don't know if you know about that story, but she was a woman who killed her kid. She put the child's body in a plastic bag. I believe, was it in her trunk or she buried it? I don't remember the exact details. It's too many murder stories out there. But she went partying the next day, and there was a picture of her partying. It's very tragic. And now that lady she got off, and now she's pregnant again. So people would say, that is an injustice. She belongs in life in prison, but she was able to, her lawyer knew how to play the game. He knew how to, and served essentially the devil to get a murderous, demonic woman off of justice, right? She's free, having fun, when she should be in a cell, isolated, and stuff like that. So it's very interesting how he goes on to that. So he continues further. Now he's going to talk about revolution. So he says, all men recognize the right of revolution, that is, the right to refuse allegiance to and to resist the government when its tyranny or its inefficiency are great and unendurable. But almost all say that such is not the case now. But such was the case, they think, in the Revolution of '75. If one were to tell me that this was bad government because it taxed certain foreign commodities brought to its ports, it is most probable that I should not make an ado about it, for I can do without them. All machines have their friction, and possibly this does enough good to counterbalance the evil. At any rate, it is a great evil to stir on about it, but when the friction comes to have its machine, and oppression of robbery are organized, I say, let us not have such a machine any longer. In other words, when a sixth of the population of a nation which has undertaken to be the refuge of liberty are slaves, and a whole country is unjustly overrun and conquered by foreign army and subjected to military law, I think that it is not too soon for honest men to rebel and revolutionize. What makes this duty the more urgent is the fact that the country so overrun is not our own, but ours is an invading army. Okay, so, first off, he was against slavery. He was an abolitionist. He did not like slavery in America. And so, when he keeps saying how, he's, again, the machine of government and oppresses its people. And when he says robbery, he views taxation as theft. And so, He did go to jail for not paying his taxes. It was like a poll tax, and that tax was used to somehow go to slaveholders. So he rebelled and was like, I'm not paying my taxes for 6 years. The government came, they locked him up by force, and he rebelled, but then his friend paid his bill, and he got out. But he was like, at least my money's not going towards that. My friend paid the bill. I didn't want him to, but he did. And so when he continues, like, all men recognize the right of revolution. Now, if you remember, family, even if you don't, though, I'll remind you, the Second Amendment is a right laid out in the Constitution, the Second Amendment, that humans have the right to have, bear arms. And that doesn't mean just for hunting, right? So that you can have a militia can mean a group, it can mean a lot of different things. But you can have an organized effort to overthrow your government if they become tyrannical. Now, how would that happen if Beto O'Rourke, for example, he is a scummy politician, no offense to Beto O'Rourke fans, but honestly, he wants forced mandatory door-to-door confiscation of firearms. And indeed, you may not like AR-15s. Indeed, you may not, family. But remember, when the United States went into Vietnam, they had a hard time with people who were simply in sandals and working rice swamps, and they were able to hold off soldiers. And those poor Vietnam soldiers were a pawn in the war, right? The war of commodification, the war of hegemony, okay? Poor them. Poor everybody. And people got rich off of the backs of the soldiers and off the bones of the Vietnamese, which is terrible. So, if you don't have a right to firearms in any way, and they say, oh, well, we're just banning high capacities. Well, Chicago has banned guns all outright, but the criminals still have them. And now the cartels just have another item to sell in their catalog, So, you don't really solve the problem. You just make it difficult for good, law-abiding people to defend themselves. And so, if you have an army like the United States, let's say, you never know if they can use, now, futuristic example. Let's take this further, okay? The right to revolutionize. Let's take Thoreau's idea to a modern idea. We do know they are inventing robots for the military. Killer robots. If you just do a quick Google search, you'll see plenty of authentic, peer-reviewed research articles that explore military robots, but also promote it, okay? Now, if you have a simple little tiny firearm, pew, 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 and that robot wants to get you, and that robot obeys a code that was coded into it by someone else, you, my friend, are going to be in some trouble. Now, if you had a powerful weapon, you might have a fighting chance against, a robot that's been sent to get you. And if you don't believe me, family, even the pop culture and Netflix, the series Black Mirror, what was the name of that episode? I don't remember the name of the episode, but I think it was season 3. Where a robot, a drone-like looking thing, well, I don't know if it can fly, so it wouldn't necessarily be a drone, but it looked like a chihuahua-sized robot, chases this lady, okay? So, she has a hard time getting away. So, now that our culture is moving more and more towards robotics, okay? That means slowly, the military will also incorporate robots as well. And then we have to conclude, what does sovereignty for a person mean in an age where a robot can just be a click and sent to get you? Okay? So, Thoreau, I wonder what he would say. The right of revolution, and then I wonder how he would look at the state's endorsement of robots. And if they say, and I think I agree sometimes, is that if we don't do it, someone else is going to do it. So, look, robots are coming either way. And then he continues on an interesting note. I quarrel not with far-off foes, but with those who, near at home, cooperate with and do the beating of those far away, and without whom the latter would be harmless. We are accustomed to say that the mass of men are unprepared, but improvement is slow, because the few are not materially or wiser or better than the many. It is not so important that many should be as good as you, as that there be some absolute goodness somewhere. And so, he continues to say how he wants people to not just stand around with their hands in their pockets and do nothing. And that if you oppose something, it's not good enough to just be like, well, I can't really do anything. You have to find some way, even if it's like a fraction of a percent, to help cure that ill that you don't like. And he has a very interesting thing on voting, which is fantastic and kind of sad if you think about it. But he says, all voting is a sort of gaming, like checkers or backgammon, with a slight moral tinge to it. A playing with right and wrong, with moral questions, and betting naturally accompanies it. Hi. I mean, that's accurate, but it's also sad, right, family? So he wants us to, to really have our own thoughts and to really know who we are and to realize that our life is not just to be here to working for a company. No, you are an entity that exists and needs to live and be around nature, and to understand you are not just a cog in a wheel. So Thoreau is very powerful. He's the one who said that all men live quiet lives of desperation. Well, how does it go? All men live silent lives of quiet desperation. Something like that. It's in another chapter. I don't have it off the top of my head. But you'll see a lot of Thoreau quotes everywhere. So if you haven't read Thoreau, I highly recommend it. It's a pretty interesting cat. He's very intelligent, very metaphorical, and definitely worth the read. So, yeah.